after having this interesting debate in the previous session, we move to this new one that we have now. And I'm honored to have here with me Enzo De Laurentiis and Paulo Magina, that have been so nice to come and contribute to this conference that we are trying to make grow each year. So we move to the topic of this session, which is innovation in public procurement. And we're gonna talk about innovation because, okay, this has been one of the most voted topic of last year, participants to the conference. So there were many asking to talk about this. We've been happy to take the suggestion. I will leave the floor to Enzo and Paulo. We're gonna see how they are gonna open up the field, and then we will be looking for your questions. So please be prepared to that, because the vibrant debate is what we really encourage and would like to have. So Enzo De Laurentiis, he is Chief Procurement Officer at the World Bank. The floor is yours. You have 30 minutes. I will start to signal if you're going late. Okay? 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Annalisa, and good morning, everyone. Allow me to begin by thanking Gustavo Piga and the university for inviting me to this stunning location to talk about my favorite subject, and also give me the opportunity to talk a little bit about how the World Bank has changed, and this reform that became effective in July 2016 that we like to call a once-in-a-generation reform, because it really introduced a new paradigm for procurement. Anyway, so I will assume that you know everything about the World Bank, so I will not tell you much about it. Suffice to say, for this purpose, that we generate a procurement market with our investment projects, because we do other type of lending too, approximately 24 billion a year, which is about to become double in the next few years, because we had a major vote of confidence from our shareholders during our recent spring meetings. Basically, we had a major capital increase by $13 billion that brings our firepower, our financial firepower, from about 45 billion a year in lending to about 100 billion. So you can imagine what impact we can have on markets. And if you also complement that with the significant policy advice and reforms, technical assistance that we do with the countries, you can see we have a significant opportunity to also influence behavior change, both in the private sector and in governments. We lend in every sector of the economy. The infrastructure is obviously, in terms of size, is the lion's share. So, transport and water and energy. Okay, so that's enough about what the World Bank is, and I hope you know a lot about what we have been doing. But I think to begin discussing innovation and also how we see innovation, I think it's important to see how the role of procurement has changed in modern government. And really, the evolution of procurement in the bank is aligned to that. It's mirroring that. It's essentially a strategic policy tool and a management tool to achieve a broad range of social and economic development objectives. That's what it is, right? It's delivering services, first and foremost, today was mentioned, but it is also to help achieve environmental policies, social objectives, labor, and really, look at how the processes are designed to ensure that there is the right balance between all these objectives. So, essentially, it is not about the cost, but it's about achieving results. So for us at the bank, it's really achieving results on the ground for our clients with value for money, and of course, integrity as well, as was mentioned this morning. So some of the major, elements that sort of disrupted all this. One is, of course, procurement is also critical to help achieve some of the global goals that all the countries, agreed to. For example, the Sustainable development goals. I mean, climate change is another one. So, how this has impacted, for example, infrastructure is major. Sustainable infrastructure is really the way of providing the basis for sustainable growth. And this you have private sector and public sector coming together. I mean, the agenda of the B7 and B20 is very much aligned with the G7 and G20. I've been to meetings where, the topic, really led by the private sector, but, talking about this partnership was all about sustainable development, but it's all about, for example, resource efficiency, moving from a linear to a circular economy, use of recycled materials, and of course, doing this with protecting the communities that are impacted and creating jobs. I mean, with this, for example, move to a circular economy with green procurement, there's a creation of green jobs. There is a move to working more with small and medium enterprises, which provide a lot of innovation. They actually are capable to bring in new technologies and new approaches that are critical to implement this agenda. So there's really a broad economic and social development. And of course, scanning the horizon, it's a very, very important role of any policy, institution, anybody who focuses on policy and procurement. It's kind of anticipating how things are changing. I mean, think about innovation is impacting every aspect of procurement, infrastructure, for example, in a way that is almost difficult to comprehend. Think how, driverless cars are going to impact transport. By the year 2040, 25% of the global market is going to be driverless cars. The way drone cargo is going to change, transportation. The way now infrastructure needs to be built in a much more integrated way, in a much more thinking about multiple uses, like water and energy, how, for example, you build an energy grid, but also thinking about future needs for example, electric cars that will require. I mean, really you need to think about future as you do procurement. And the role of policy is to be prepared for that, right? Thinking what's coming down the road in a few years and be prepared with a policy response, with an alignment of resources and monitoring, evaluation, and so forth. So innovation, it's a critical, both an objective of procurement, but also procurement itself has to leverage the latest, innovative practices to do better. In fact, it is a fundamental objective of the government to put in place conditions that harness innovation in the market in order to, secure a constant, constantly higher value for the taxpayers, right? That's a role of a role of government. So if it is, in fact, the government the biggest buyer, has a unique position to drive innovation. I mean, think about what defense procurement has done in the US, for example, and NASA, driving, companies like McDonnell Douglas or IBM to innovate and change completely technology. In the UK, the role of government in completely changing the dynamics in the market for software, for example, using agile procurement and really, helping moving completely to open source and hosted on the cloud. I mean, so these are really a very conscious decision that the government makes to use the procurement as a strategic tool to move the market in a certain direction, to innovate. And of course, also using innovative practice, and I'll talk a little more about that to do procurement better. So what do we do to align to this? Essentially, we moved from an approach where we work more or less the same way everywhere, in China or a small island of the Pacific, to one where we adapt our procurement strategy to the unique characteristic of the operating environment. That means the country, the capacity, of course, the market, the stakeholders, the risks, but also the market. I mean, markets are very different the way they work, right? So it's essential for your procurement strategy to think about what is the relevant market and how to attract the right bidders. There's no value in procurement if the best, the best means the right one, that can give you the best value are not incentivized to come and give you their best value. You can have a beautiful process, based on rules, but no real value for money, no real result. So that also requires a very proactive engagement with the market. From the very beginning, it actually requires a partnership, requires thinking about, as a buyer, that's what we ask our clients to do. Think as a buyer of yourself as the market sees you. What are your failures? What makes the market perhaps not very interested? And what can you do to adapt your procurement strategy and your approach to ensure that they see this is a good deal, a good business? I'll give you an example. We're trying to model this in the bank. We had a major project in Central Asia, huge, where there are few bidders. We know that. They're the big companies. Nobody came the first stage of this large contract. So we started asking, why didn't you come? Well, the risk allocation was wrong, the governance of the project was not right, the specs were not right. So what do? We sat down with the buyer, of course with the client, with the country, but also with all the key players, and invited anybody else who wanted to come and start sharing specs, start sharing documents proactively, start saying, what can we improve? Well, long story short, because it takes a little bit of time, everybody came. And so why did you come? Because now we trust. And they gave, their best, the best. So anyway, that's the something that is changing, and I think maybe it's a little bit different from what I've heard this morning. It's this proactive partnership with a broad range of stakeholders. Civil society is another one, but particularly with the market. Now, contract management was mentioned this morning. I mean, really value for money, it's sometimes lost completely during contract management. So, it really starts with the right planning, and was mentioned by this morning by Circo, and it has to be maintained during contract management, which requires to have, the right risk management approach. And we really start with identifying the risks. What are the risks? And not only build them in the selection phase, but wire them into the contract. But it's more than that. It's not just the contract. Contract management is an expertise. So it's really using the right key performance indicators, which you prepared from the very beginning, to monitor, to have remedial actions to follow up, to change the contract, to do all the things that you need to do to maintain the value for money throughout the life of the contract. So fit for purpose is a key enabler for value for money. Adapt to the unique circumstances. Value for money is more than cost. Value for money is life cycle cost, was mentioned this morning, but it's also the ability to give weight to different elements that are not monetarily. And this I have to depart from my very good friend this morning who mentioned the importance of having everything in monetary terms. It's not possible when you're looking at, for example, a better way to do a construction, a better methodology, or a better way to manage the impact of health risks on the community, or a better way to do supply chain management. You cannot do it by monetary terms, so you have to have points. So that's what we're doing now. We're using points also, similar to the procurement consultants that you are familiar with. Not in every case, but in some cases we can do that. We use value engineering a lot more, maintaining basic function, but improving performance methods, improving materials. So this constant, we use a lot more collaborative approaches like competitive dialogue. You may be familiar, it's used also in the European Union. We do more negotiations, always keeping sort of an integrity environment. For example, when we do these methods, we ask for a parallel probity audit to observe, but basically allowing the parties to start from a very vague definition of what you need, ask the market, how are you going to do this in very different ways, focus on outputs, and really being able to compare different ways in a professional and as much as possible defined way to then have really innovation. You stifle innovation the more you define the requirements and the more you define in strict terms the way you evaluate. Okay, so this is basically what we did. So there's a lot of things, and I don't have time to tell you about all, but sustainability, it's critical. We leverage technology a lot. I mean, for us, but also, of course, also we use procurement now to help our clients to leverage technology to give better development solutions. But for us, for example, we use much better tracking of all transactions. We use geotagging for projects. We have apps, several apps. For example, an app that allows us to merge geotag information with documents and with social media that gives feedback. So we have an app that is available to everybody. It's called the Procurement app, the World Bank Procurement app, that gives you contracts for the last 20 years. You can organize them by sector, by supplier country, so you can actually see who won, how much, trends, and so forth. So these are just examples. As I said, transparency is important. I completely agree, but it's not a result of the procurement process. It's a condition. So you have to have a system that is built on transparent processes for planning, transparent contracting, and then, of course, information, that was mentioned earlier too, that is shared as much as possible. And this, we are at the frontier in the bank. Beside having pretty much everything except for deliberative, meaning like our internal discussions, everything public, we also now, we're the first institution to publish information on beneficial ownership. That was kind of mentioned this morning. So basically, we ask for large contracts to declare who owns more than 25%, the individuals that owns more than 25% of controlling interest. The European Union is looking into it. The UK is trying to do it. So anyway, we're focused on. I don't want you to think that we threw away the baby with the bathwater, but we look at transparency as sort of the enabling environment. The focus is results. The focus of procurement is value for money, which is this real balance between quality and cost. Okay, so this is moving fast. I mean, our policy is principle-based, but that's the way it is in modern government, meaning that this places a premium on professional judgment. So you have to be able, to justify with a lot of evidence why a certain decision is the right decision, but not with the straitjacket of, very prescriptive rules. One role of procurement in government, obviously, that depends on what your constituency want, but most governments now have this agenda, and we certainly do it at the World Bank, is to drive environmental and social best practices. So, in our documents, we have very significant requirements for this, because these are threats to contract implementation when you have a major impact on the environment or the community that paralyzes the contract. So proactively, we look at ways by raising the bar for the contractors, by having many different things that we require to manage those risks during the contract, by providing incentives to go beyond the minimum requirements, like, for example, in the form of a provisional sum that is paid and is not part of the evaluation, so it doesn't penalize you for giving something more, but it does give you the reward if you give something more. So this is a bit what I do every day now. The PPPs were mentioned a lot today. That's critical because, look, it's about development, but not only. I mean, we are a drop in the sea of needs to meet the development needs, but it's not just developing countries. Think about infrastructure. But the year 2040, I think, what I've read, the infrastructure gap is going to be about 94 trillion, which means that, even institutional investors, government for sure, no MDBs, but even institutional investor cannot meet those needs. So the only way to do that is leveraging private sector money, right? So that's why PPPs are becoming so important, and that's why it's critical to have this partnership, to create this trust that mobilizes capitals that are used in different ways, less, even with less interest and less, to bring them in. We, for example, just launched, IDA, the International Development Association. I'm not sure if you're familiar, it's the part of the World Bank that lends on concessional terms to the poorest country, has just issued the first bond, which was oversubscribed, $1.5 billion oversubscribed, which means that people are investing in bonds for the poorest, the most fragile, the most difficult country, because that is also good business. Anyway, so that's what we're doing at the bank, there's so much more that I would like to say, but I don't have the time. So for what I wanted to say, a few examples of how the world of procurement is changing beyond necessarily the World Bank. What are they like, sort of cutting-edge things? Well, one thing that it's with a backdrop of hyperconnectivity and technology that allows us to do a lot of different things. As I mentioned, this idea of partnering, that's an idea that is very pervasive, how you work together, right? So it's basically how you move from a an adversarial approach to a collaborative approach that is basically a new business relationship that maximizes value by maximizes the comparative advantage of the parties. That is a very, very different way of writing contracts, for example. You write contracts now primarily to protect the parties, right? The rights of the parties. Now, the new approach is to write a contract to protect the to mitigate the risk to achieving the result of the contract, starting from the assumption that the parties are a team. They work together with the same objective. So that is a very different way to write the contract. It's a very different way to select even, because you have to start where trust is part of the selection. So you have to look at similar values. You have to look at experience in this partnering and so forth. So that's a very, very different way. And they're different, of course. By the way, this is done. And nothing that I'm telling you today, it's just like out there. UK is doing it. London Crossrail project is the most successful and biggest infrastructure in the world is using partnering and all the most advanced ways of doing that with pain gain mechanism, you know, to share benefits and of course risks with target fee arrangements. I mean, these are technical terms, but you know, at site variation control. But there are ways of doing it together as a team. And focusing on the results and constantly monitor. That requires a very structured management approach. It's not that simple. You have to monitor performance of the contract as you go. So very good ways of following up on how the contract is maintaining its value and being able to redirect as necessary. So that's, you have to change the contract very frequently. But not because because you're working together. So you have to keep, the value for money by seeing how the environment is changing, the situation is changing, and keep the contract on track. So that's an example, and there are very various forms of that. Agile procurement, for example, is done a lot for the software development. Basically, I don't know if you're familiar with the Six Sigma Lean, which basically it's an approach, a management approach to streamline processes, to identify where there are the inefficiencies, eliminate inefficiencies, and improve outcome. So agile procurement of software is done by putting together teams that include developers and clients, and they work together to go with this process called sprints, where they go from small problem to small problem to small problem. So basically, it's iterative and collaborative, right? And that is done everywhere now in the UK, in some other countries, for software, but the idea, it's similar to applying to a collaborative approach, could be used in other ways. Okay. These are all different, and I don't have a lot of time, but basically, there are two or three things you do. You do category management first, meaning you really focus on different type of procurements, build really deep skills on that, right? Rail versus water. So that gives you the credibility to work much more collaborative with the engineers of the counterparts. And then you manage that relationship in a much more proactive way, again, like you are a real team with the client. I mean, between the client and the supplier. And so that's generally the approach. Data, of course, are essential because all this is evidence-based. You need to have KPIs that really are very strong. So you have to have many systems that are very, very good. And then there's all these other aids to technology. Give you artificial intelligence is used now for this because you machine-readable documents, and you can do all this analysis very quickly, in a time that maybe would take 100 people, and you can do it very quickly. And then there are other things that are coming out that are really fascinating that will change completely the scenario. 3D printing is used a lot already, believe it or not. They're printing a bridge in the Netherlands, but other places they're printing pylons, for construction. Think about how this will change the risk allocation. I mean, the labor parts of it, very, very different. Okay, this one I already mentioned. Use of drones, I mentioned. It's not only changing cargo, but it's used extensively for supervision now. Again, there are great examples where all the supervision, but also all the mapping is done by drone, even analysis of soil and things like that. We even have 2 drones at the World Bank that we actually own, but it's really the contractors now that they are using more and more. Blockchain is a frontier. Well, it is a little bit for procurement, but not in general. It's being used, of course, for Bitcoins. It's basically, the idea of this shared ledger, which, you don't have one, centralized database, but you have a shared, among many different participants using cryptography, which makes very secure because you can put new information, but you cannot change it, right? So that really is going to be a major potential way of increasing both transparency, but also efficiency of, for example, smart contracts, right, where everything all the information are kept or managed through the blockchain technology. For supply chain management, things like fair labor issues, certifications. When you have a very long supply chain with many, and it's very difficult to know where the goods have been at any time, supply chain potentially, this is not yet used too much, certainly not in the public sector, but it's used in the private sector already, can help really manage all those risks. Auditing, performance management, and so forth. All that will not change. I mean, will be in the shared ledger, and as party continue to include, you have this form of digital trust, right? Because you don't have to have a third party that is the broker. It's the system that is built in a way that is shared, is monitored, and everybody can see what's happening at the same time, and nobody can change the record. So that's how it works. So I think I've stayed within my allocation. Of course, this is as I said, a fascinating topic that I could talk about for a few days. But the question also for you is, what's next? So is procurement going to be just a tool, or is going to be what leads innovation, what leads economic growth, and creates the condition for our future, and in our case, to improve the lives of million of people around the world. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Enzo. You've been the first one to follow, so you thought about your first question. So thank you, because you listened to what I was asking. Okay, so very interesting. I will keep later on. I will keep the keyword incentives, because this is something that on which we can reason a lot, both on incentive to innovate and what I found interesting in the incentive to being able to write a contract that is going towards the same objective. So I will ask you to think about this later on. Okay, so we pass to Paulo Magina. He is the head of procurement of the public procurement unit at OECD. So again, Paulo, thanks a lot. You will have 30 minutes for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning to all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Gustavo and Annalisa, for the invitation. I think it's a nice combination with teaching at Tor Vergata now, this broader outreach initiative. And thanks for inviting the OECD to talk about innovation in public procurement. I will bring a different perspective. I will talk more about the policy side, how countries are using procurement to address innovation and other policy objectives. And it's always a challenge to talk after Enzo. We have been doing this in several occasions, and he always covers first the key concepts and the key pillars of strategic procurement. So, well, at least that part is covered already. I would like to start by maybe explaining to you what we are doing at OECD in terms of public procurement. Many of you already heard me about it, but I think it's a good occasion just to highlight some of the work we are doing. And I will focus, as I said, my presentation on a specific area on innovation in terms of using procurement. But as I go along all these work streams, I find a lot of innovation in different areas, and we could talk about innovation for days, as Enzo mentioned. And in many areas that we are working, we see innovation, not just in terms of the outcomes, but also in terms of the way procurement processes are conducted. So first of all, the OECD is an economic organization. We are here because public procurement matters. Public procurement represents 12% of GDP in OECD. 16% in the European Union, as you know, and in some parts of the world, it goes from 18 to 30% when we are talking about emerging economies. So procurement has a very important economic dimension, and that's something we are always also trying to understand, is to come up with the economic dimension of procurement, and that is an innovation in itself. So the OECD is working now in bridging the gap between the public procurement, the outcomes of public procurement, and the impact in the economy. And I hope by the end of the year to be able to present you with some innovative ideas about the way procurement and most especially central purchasing bodies are impacting the economy. We are working with some EU countries and OECD members outside of Europe to understand this dimension, which I think is an innovation in itself. And that's part of the work we are doing. And also, of course, we work with countries bilaterally, many OECD countries. Some of you here in the room already worked with us and have been working. And I listed some of the countries in the slide, but besides those countries, we are also currently working, for instance, with Germany. And innovation was one of the dimensions we covered in the review we did with Germany. And we are also working, for instance, in Lithuania, just to mention a couple of countries, European countries. We always try to identify good practices and share these good practices amongst our communities. And that's why we developed some work on green 3 years ago. We did the compendium on green procurement. We did also work for the G20 on enhancing transparency in public procurement. And last year, or 1 year and a half ago, we produced a compendium on innovation. So public procurement for innovation, and that's the basic of my presentation. My main part of the presentation is about this compendium. I have here a couple of copies of this report that I'm happy to give you, and also to share with you the links to access our publications in our website. And after innovation, we are now working on SMEs, and I hope that by October, during the OECD Procurement Week, I will be able to share with you the way countries are using procurement to support small and medium enterprises. And most likely in the chain, we will be working on responsible business conduct and social procurement, which is also a very important topic. And finally, another area of innovation is the work we are doing with the methodology for assessing procurement systems. Many of you already heard about it. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but just to say that both the revision process of the methodology and the outcomes, and so the new methodology in itself, I believe it's a good example of collaborative innovation. We coordinated and worked together with many international organizations, namely the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, many other of the multi-development banks you heard in the morning, but also countries and bilateral donors and so on, to improve this methodology and to make it universal, to be able to evaluate a procurement system regardless of the income level. And this methodology, I believe, will set the standard in terms of assessing procurement systems internationally. Well, strategic procurement was already mentioned. For us, it's the way procurement is used to address other policy objectives, and I listed here some of those objectives: sustainable growth, development of SMEs, responsible business conduct, social policy objectives, and of course, innovation. Innovation is probably one of the most relevant ones, because it has a direct impact in the economy, in the way processes are structured, and the outcomes and the impacts to citizens. And OECD countries already understood this dimension of public procurement, the strategic dimension of public procurement. If you look at these numbers, public procurement strategies and policies are already being developed by OECD countries to support these policies through procurement. You see green procurement, almost all OECD countries have it. SMEs, the same thing. Innovation, a bit less, but still 80% of the countries have at some point developed strategies at the central level or by some procuring entities. and responsible business conduct a bit less. So you see, there is nothing new about it. What is maybe challenging is the way countries are doing it and how they are able to address these different policy objectives through public procurement. And by recognizing the impact, they are making it mandatory. These numbers are taken from our publication Government at a Glance, which is every 2 years we do a compendium of information about the way governments are moving in different areas, from regulatory issues to budget to human management, and also procurement is one of the most important chapters of this publication, and it's the second one, most downloaded one. And you see here that governments are taking a mandatory use of procurement for secondary policy objectives. If you compare 2012 to 2016, there is an increase in the way governments make it mandatory. So how can we address innovation through public procurement? We heard about different ways, about different means of innovation. We are talking about innovation in the sense of changing the procurement process, embedding innovative tools into the procurement process and system, and Enzo already mentioned some of them. But we are also talking about the development of procurement for innovative solutions and the pre-commercial procurement, which are two concepts very common to Europeans in the room, which is the way that public service and the way public service addresses products or services that are not available in the market or that can be developed through the power of public buyer. And that is something that we need to be aware of, the power of the public buyer. The public buyer is capable of influencing markets. Public buyer is capable of changing market behaviors, consumer behaviors, and that is why innovation in public procurement is so relevant. Okay, so why strategic public procurement for innovation? Because we believe in innovation. We believe innovation is one of the highest potential areas in terms of impact in the economic growth. And many OECD countries, as I said, are already using it to foster innovation through procurement. But we believe more can be done and there is room for improvement in this area. And so the information I will share with you now is part of this report that I mentioned, the Public Procurement for Innovation, Good Practices and Strategies. So in terms of the impacts of innovation projects through procurement, I think one key aspect that you need to retain, there is a clear link between innovation and outcomes, and better outcomes. So when we do innovation, we are not doing innovation just for the sake of being trendy or fashionable. We are doing innovation because there are better outcomes in the line. So we are talking about effectiveness, we are talking about efficiency, about improved user satisfaction. So these are the reported impacts from the innovation projects we collected in our study. At the same time, these are the areas where the countries have implemented successfully innovation projects. So innovation is not just something that provides better outcomes, but it is something that is cross-cutting. And if you look at the different areas that are in this slide, you will see that innovation spreads across all areas, from social protection to public order and safety, education, health, transportation, energy, and so on. And at the same time, one key finding of our study is that innovation in itself is capable of also improving other policy objectives. By addressing innovation in a project, you can support small and medium enterprises, and you can develop green and sustainable projects. So there is let's say, a multilateral dimension to innovation in terms of the impact. So some practices from the Public Procurement for Innovation report. This report covered 28 OECD countries and 7 non-OECD countries at the time. 2 of them became part of our 37 member countries now. And you see that Enzo already mentioned the partnership aspect. And it's very important to, I think, for you to understand that you need partners to develop innovation. You cannot do it alone. So you see that the procurement for innovation was carried out in collaboration with external partners most of the time. So either the private sector, other public institutions, research institutions, and so on. So there is clearly a partnership dimension also in innovation. And when countries do procurement for innovation, they try to meet new needs and demands. So that's also very important. And not surprisingly, the main beneficiaries are citizens and public sector services, of course. Another very interesting result that we can take from the survey is that there is, in many cases, an innovation procurement action plan. So 2/3 of the countries, they developed this kind of action plan in terms to address in a more coordinated and structured way innovation in terms of procurement. Some countries, they developed only specific actions. 80% of the countries, they go for this way. Most interestingly as well, the measurement. The measurement of the impact of innovation is still not there, and there is, this is one area that we need to address, how to measure the impact of innovation, how to make sure that the results of the innovative projects are well understood, either by quality or quantity, but more than half of the countries are not measuring the impact of innovation yet. Okay, so what are the approaches that countries are using to address innovation in terms of procurement? You see here the comparison between 2014 and 2016. There is a decrease in terms of the preferential treatment, but there is a strong emphasis in terms of documentation and providing guidance, focusing on innovative procurement. Also in terms of developing legislation and provisions that will support innovation in procurement, and of course the directives from 2014 being transposed to the European countries are a key dimension of this transformation. But it's also interesting to understand that many countries, they developed specific units specialized on innovation at the central level. And we have here in the room maybe examples of these kind of units, either be it competence centers like in Germany or other kind of units that are there to address procurement, innovation in procurement at the central level, and then capable of disseminating the knowledge and the information to others. Just a few maybe examples and a few ideas for you to consider in your own countries in terms of developing targets for innovation procurement. You can do it by developing quantified targets or qualified targets, of course. I listed here some examples, and you have in many European countries a specific target for innovation procurement, 5% in Finland, 2% for SMEs in France, 3% in Spain. In Korea, for instance, 20% of the procurement needs to be carried to some products or services where this certification for new technology is given. And also some other countries go for more qualified targets and promoting procurement for innovation in a more, let's say, qualitative way. Doing innovation in procurement is not easy. It's something that is quite difficult, and in fact, many countries reported back a lot of challenges in terms of implementing innovation in procurement. So I listed here the main challenges faced, and I think, well, most of us here in the room are practitioners, so we understand quite well this list of challenges faced by countries, starting with the risk aversion. And of course, many procurement systems are compliance-based, so it's very difficult to move away from rules and regulations and address innovation in a way that is not seen as breaching the law. So we need to give room and give flexibility to have this kind of different mindset in terms of developing innovation in procurement. And I would say some countries do it better than others, and we see, for instance, in the Nordic countries, there is a different approach to innovation because they are capable of having this trust-based approach to procurement, and so they don't question the way people do procurement and the reasons they choose certain options. So that is something maybe we need to consider in terms of changing the mindset in other jurisdictions. But there are also issues in terms of management and coordination, in terms of capacity, in terms of the number and the skills of the people that run the procurement processes, and also in terms of political support. So these are some of the challenges that were identified by the countries when they replied to our survey 2 years ago. And yes, I have time. So I would like to conclude by talking about the way to overcome these challenges. So we kind of divided these, let's say, approaches to overcome the challenges in terms of 4 tiers. So the first one would be to increase and solidify financial resources to give to innovation procurement in terms of outreach, in terms of support to suppliers, and in terms of monitoring and measuring the impact. That's the first tier, let's say. A second one will be to address the changes that are required in terms of the culture and the awareness. And that is something that we cannot do by decree. So that requires a lot of work and collaboration and a lot of engagement amongst the stakeholders that are part of this process. Another layer will be working on the legal frameworks by changing laws, regulations, and so on to allow a better approach and more flexible approach to strategic innovation procurement. And finally, the last one will be the professionalization, which is a key dimension in terms of the public procurement, not just for innovation, but in general. So we are working a lot on professionalization, on capacity building in many countries, in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, and so on. And that is something that needs to be present all the time. So the professionalization dimension, either be it innovation, e-procurement, any other dimension of the public procurement system, needs to be present, and the strategy needs to be developed for this. So taking into consideration everything that I've been telling you, the report finishes with a framework that kind of tries to address all the challenges and all the things that countries are facing in terms of putting it in a sort of 9 areas that countries should follow if they want to address innovation in procurement. So these 9 areas for action are listed here in the slide. So they go from policies and strategies with targets to using procurement tools like e-procurement and standardization as a means to address innovation in procurement. And so, of course, professionalization is there, stakeholder engagement, awareness raising, and the risk management and the impact measurement as well. So basically, this is what I wanted to share with you in terms of the way the OECD has been receiving and collecting information about public procurement and the way procurement is used for innovation. And as I said at the beginning, this is just one of the dimensions of innovation that we could talk here. So we could continue here the rest of the day, but well, we have more important things to do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paulo, for your clear presentation and description. So this is time for your questions, for opening the debate to both the speeches that you heard. So who's starting? Okay, we're gonna have, please say your name. There's the microphone there. Is coming the microphone? Microphone? Here it is. Greta, here. Okay. So please say your name, please, before talking.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank for a very interesting presentation from the World Bank about the latest developments you've got in the innovation and procurement. And of course, we'd like to congratulate on having decided to increase your firepower and being on the way to overtake the European Investment Bank in the volume of the lending. I'm Remigijus Tragnis from the European Investment Bank. My question would be, you mentioned new solutions foreseen at the World Bank in this area, and I'd like to ask you, between them, you mentioned massive training and certification. What would be the main elements in this area the World Bank foresees? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question and the congratulations. So, look, first of all, I think Paulo mentioned one of the critical aspects of any reform like this is the change management part. So, that what's called the soft part is not soft at all, and that's the most difficult thing, the culture change. So there's been massive training on that for our staff to begin with, to understand. You have to look things through the different lenses, right? Not the lenses of the rules. The rules still are there, right? And they're actually apply and everything, but it's how people who make decisions at the World Bank make decision based, their principles, right? What drives is the principle. Okay, so lots of training started with our staff first to make sure that they started understanding how to operate under this new paradigm. Then, of course, there is massive training on the new methods, right? Because there are very different ways to do. So we've done a lot of training for us, but we're doing major training with all the borrowers, right? The massive online training, because the best way, there are like 6,000, 7,000 people that already took these courses. And for each country, there is one done that is customized to the country. So, we have staff in almost every country where we operate, and we organize this training. But it has to be very, very practical and very based on the project, right? So we started with a project that we're using the new. So first there were some general, this is the new reform, that's how you do this analysis, because they're very specific tools, by the way. This is not done like that, right? I don't have time to talk about all the tools that we're using that are the cutting-edge tools for do supply positioning, risk assessments, things that you have to do to understand the market. For market assessment, number one. So that's the biggest training. We started with that. How do you understand the dynamics in the market? What moves the key players? How to think of, depending on the different type of procurement and the different risks that the procurement and the size, what is your market, your target market, and what is that market interested in, and how do you attract them, right? So there's all different ways of doing that. So that was our biggest first training. And then it's topical, like how do you do a competitive dialogue, how do you do BAFO, how do you do it? But, so there's a lot of technical training, but there's also a lot of outreach to the private sector. So that's an engagement that it's very, very intense, because it's a bit of a triangular relationship, right? So explain the private sector, how we are changing and our governments are changing, explaining the government how they need to attract the private sector, and explaining our staff how to, think differently. So we started, as I said, with this internal, and also we have a certification for our staff. Everybody is being certified, and now almost everybody, it will be in this next couple of months, after a full year of using it, will be actually accredited. Meaning, like, if they have demonstrated during the year that they can actually not only know the rules, but they know how to think, strategically and apply them in this new way, that will be actually accredited. If not, they will be accredited as soon as they can. So there is a certification, which is more knowledge, accreditation, and then, of course, there is a continuous accreditation. They have to keep that. So that's basically what we have done. But as I said, the most complex one, and the one that in some ways is still ongoing, is this change management, right? It doesn't happen overnight. So it's something that you have to keep up, and you have to continually monitor and ensure that, this is mainstream. I'll take this an opportunity to say that innovation, it's true, it's great to do a plan. I mean, I agree. But innovation is not invention, right? It's not something you say, okay, I want to innovate. Innovation has to become part of your business process. So you have to become part of your DNA. So that's over time, everything you think in terms of solutions, right? Not in terms of process. What is the solution you want to achieve to a difficult problem? How do you match unrealized innovation with unmet needs? And so it becomes part of everything you do, not a separate thing. So this is all the outreach, training, certification, and using different modalities that we're doing.
Okay, thank you. So some other questions from the floor? Nobody? Okay, Professor Piga? No, and there's another, okay. Now, Professor, no, that's okay, and then there's another one on the...
To Paulo, 15 years ago, I was a member of an expert committee at the European Commission on innovative procurement. It was one of the first expert meetings. Since this 15 years have gone by, many expert panels have been created at the European Commission. Still, and we teach innovation, innovative procurement in the master. And we always ask ourselves how important it is to teach innovative procurement in the master, because I think that we have a doubt on how important is innovative procurement. In this sense, I see innovative procurement as in two possible ways. There can be agencies that are dedicated, because of their nature, to innovation. Defense is one, and when they do procurement, they do innovation. That's the typical standard. But when I hear, and when I have been involved in debating in Europe about generating innovative procurement, this is not the kind we think. It's a different kind. It's one that basically almost doesn't have in mind a specific innovation, but does say, we are here to generate instruments to help you innovate in some way, not in a specific sector. And then you say, we should put financial resources for this, not financial resources for drones for the US Army, but we should put aside resources for people who want in some way to innovate and are constricted by the current rules, right? How would you rate, has this been successful so far in these past 15 years? Do you still believe in it very much, that at a certain point this thing is going to jump up very much in terms of size? Or do you think it's always going to be something that is going to be relevant but a little bit minor? I don't know if I've explained myself.
Oops, okay. So, thank you. Well, I cannot speak on behalf of the European Union, but I may say that the Commission has put a lot of money on innovation, and they developed a substantial amount of European money. They devoted it to innovation, and we see an uptake of this money being used in a more consistent way. We are now working with DG Regio to address strategic procurement in 5 case studies that are being selected right now across Europe. And one of these case studies will address innovation. So we are covering SMEs, innovation, sustainable, social, and so on. And the idea is to take lessons that can be then shared with other member states in terms of how to make innovation work. So I would say it's important to have the money available. It's important to be able to use it, and it's important to understand that you might fail. And if you fail, there is no harm done, and then you can do it again. Well, which is something that is not embedded in the European culture. And maybe in the US it's easier. But here, public procurement, you are not supposed to waste money in things that don't work. So that's why people are so afraid of doing innovation. So at the same time, you have to have the resources available and the money available to try things. So that's one dimension. Another one, we see in some countries, they create some programs to support innovation in procurement, and they encourage academia, they encourage the private sector, they encourage individuals to come up with solutions for problems that they put out. It's the case of Lithuania, for instance. They have certain programs that are still, they can be improved and streamlined, but they have this kind of approach that they launch calls and people can submit their solution to the problem, and if they are accepted by a commission, then they can work on that with the money that is given by the state. So there are different approaches.
Can I just add a different cut to this? And I can speak on behalf of the World Bank. No, look, I go back to the relation with the private sector. Innovation is happening, right? It's fast. There's a lot of great ideas, a lot of, industry innovation all the time. The point is to harness that, right? To use that, to leverage that. Instead of giving, R&D subsidies or doing separate things, to work with the market and get the market to help you innovate. For us, it's a very critical need. We have a whole agenda that we call disruptive technology. Basically, we realize that we're doing things the same way all the time, right? Because it works, because it's fine. And then we start talking to the market and say, well, you guys are doing things like we were doing 20 years ago, right? We have all different ways, which is precisely not to waste money. It's precisely to use the most efficient way to achieve a result with sustainability and with better results. So there's all these different agendas, like, for example, resource efficiency, which, by the way, is also very important for us, for our environmental and social framework, which require us, we cannot invent things. We need to see what's happening there and in some way stimulate that, because we give some incentives that we were saying before. But it's really the market that innovates. What procurement does as a tool helps the projects to compare very different ways of doing or of achieving a result. So procurement is a tool. So the fact that it's more flexible, principle-based, that all these methods, it's because helps really asking the market, how would you achieve this result, and comparing the different way of doing it. And the last thing I want to say is that, so this happens very well in countries that have a very thriving knowledge economy. You know this concept very well, Gustavo. It's when academia and private sector and government has this constant flow of, exchange, because that's how innovation happens. But government has to be able to stimulate that, has to work with the private sector and with academia to ask, how do you give me solutions, right? Not invention, not say, I want to, invent things. I have a problem. I have a sub-Saharan Africa where I have, 280 million people only have access to electricity, where there are 900 million people live there. Less than 10% of schools have access to electricity. Give me solutions, right? These are the type of things. And then you leverage that by being open, by being principle-based, by having all the methods that allow to do that.
Thank you. So there was someone there, Joseph? Okay, and then another one here.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Magina. What do you think about, I think it's policy in the UK that you have a dedicated budgets for state agencies, and this budget can be only used for innovative procurement. And if it is good measure, and what are the risks of it?
Thanks for calling me professor. But we are not in the
Okay.
Here it's the shootout. It's 2-0. It's me and Enzo. We are coming from the practitioner
Even
side.
before we start.
Yes, we were winning before starting. Yes. So well, I think it's as I said, is one of the possible measures to have a dedicated budget that can be used for this kind of project, but it needs to come with more structured approaches, and it needs to come with the professionalization, the capacity to develop the people and the skills. So a budget by itself is not relevant. Enzo mentioned the Crossrail project. We have been following the Crossrail project in the UK, which is probably the biggest infrastructure project in Europe these days. In the world. Well, I don't know if it's in the world, but well, it's one of the biggest for sure, which is building a series of tunnels in London to connect the railway system. And in order for them to be allowed to start the procurement, they had to carry out a series of analyses of the procurement function. So it took them 2 years or 3 years to be able to start the procurement process. But before that, they had to go to a series of checks and a list of indicators that they had to follow to address if the quality of the personnel and the skills were there in order to start the procurement process. So there is a link, between they had a huge budget to do it, but they only were able to do it after validating the capacity and the skills. For instance, in New Zealand, a very interesting example is that there is a procurement capability index in New Zealand where the government measures the quality of the procurement function, and then the budget of these agencies is changing according to the results of the capability index, which is something very interesting, that the government is using procurement as a way of understanding the effectiveness of a procurement function within a certain agency, and then by that they will change the allocation of the budget, which I think it's a very interesting way.
Thank you. So now here, that's Guillermo.
Thank you very much. My name is Guillermo Rosenwurzel from Buenos Aires and San Martin Universities, Argentina. I have first, thank you for both stimulated presentations. I have one question regarding PPPs. I wonder whether we are putting too much faith in PPP as panacea for all problems regarding public procurement. I know that, I understand that outcomes are mixed so far, and of course we must seek to promote more close relationship between the public and private sectors, but as a specific way to promote that cooperation, we may find that the innovation, the basic innovation is to help the government circumvent financial constraints rather than promote substantial innovation. In my country, in Argentina, we are discussing nowadays a lot this mechanism, and my impression is that the government is considering it to promote public investment in a context of financial constraints, but in a way that will only induce creative accounting rather than more substantial solutions.
If I may, I think this is a very good question. Look, I don't believe PPPs are a panacea. I believe they have to be used in certain cases, and it goes back to the public investment management strategy of the country. So sometimes they're done just because they're popular. So the country has to have, and that's where procurement also is taking a higher level strategic role, because that's where it starts. Are you leveraging private sector, or you're doing a traditional? So it really has to be thought through carefully. But the main thing of PPPs, the main reason of doing it is because there's not enough money to build the infrastructure. If you don't get private money to do it, you're just not going to be able to do it, as I mentioned before. So there has to be, when appropriate, a way to leverage these private sector capitals. But, for example, in procurement at the World Bank, we changed significantly the way also we approach PPPs. It's not a traditional procurement by all means. Still competition, transparency, the principles are the same, but it's the business case that really has to rule. I mean, does it stand on its own on financials, for example? So all the work that you do to determine the financial feasibility, it's critical. The business case, like, have you done the right market outreach? Again, so you have to take the show on the road, you have to get the right players, not anybody, not the wrong people, and as many as possible. So the institutional case, have you looked at the institutional capacity to manage this very complex thing, including the contract later and so forth? And have you done the right financial to ensure that the sustainability of the product? So, all this, there are 5 business cases. So there are many ways that we have changed, taking away from the formality of the process, but adding a lot to why you justify whether you do a PPP. From our point of view in procurement, of course, we work with our colleagues in the IFC and other parts of the bank, but it's really about the business case. And I agree with you. But the reason to do it is not because it's popular. The reason to do it when appropriate is because you don't want to put too much pressure on the debt of the country, and you want to also leverage this private sector. But then you have to do it carefully. Not everywhere works, so you have to build the case, the business case, in a very, very rigorous way.
Paulo wanted to say something?
Yes, just a few comments on PPPs. I'm Portuguese, so I lost my faith in PPPs a long time ago. For the Portuguese in the room, we had to learn by doing and failing. And I just wanted to say that I think there is a new generation of PPPs coming that is building on a more balanced approach, because before there was not a balanced approach, because the public sector, they didn't have the knowledge and the capacity and the institutional settings to deal with the private sector. So what we see in many countries is now governments are setting up PPP units, and they are able to build this capacity and to talk in the same terms with the private sector, which is something that was not happening before. So at the same time, we see that 95%, for instance, of OECD countries, they are using procurement frameworks for infrastructure projects, meaning that they believe that the public procurement framework is capable of addressing infrastructure and complex procurement, also PPPs, which I think it goes back to what Enzo said about the principles. So we are seeing that procurement principles are applied to infrastructure, PPPs, and other type of public service delivery in a better way, in a better governance model as well.
Can I just add though? Just want to add that we've done a study at the bank, and it really shows they're really lacking generally on transparency. They're not published, for example. There's really a lot of areas where the countries are not doing well, especially transparency. Sorry,
Okay, Gustavo? Gustavo wanted to say something, and then we have another question there.
Yes, thank you. These are two questions to Enzo. Basically, the World Bank and all the EBRD, they are principles of an agent called local government, and then there is the final agent, which is the supplier. No, so there's a chain. There's you, there's the government, and there's the supplier. You correctly told us that this thing of innovation works well where knowledge societies are thriving, right? Universities, private sector, competent government. But then you talk about sub-Saharan Africa. So aren't we aware of a danger here that basically in this chain, we're going to completely skip over the local government that knows nothing about sophisticated innovation, and we're going to deal with a procurement process which is going to have probably a multinational from the Western world coming to these countries. Capacity building will not rise because there is no chance of doing that. Local business will not thrive. Are you worried about this or not? Related to this, when you speak about KPIs, and you said correctly so, because it's your fixation, that we are here in the business of improving life, right? There's always been a criticism of you MDBs about you measuring KPIs by talking about efficiency and effectiveness and never looking at development impact. So once again, I think that the two questions are connected. Do you have KPIs that relate to development impact, especially in this field that is so critical because of what I said before? Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. Two excellent questions. Okay, on the first one, let me tell you that for us, innovation is not necessarily sophisticated. Simplicity is the mark of innovation sometimes. Innovation is solutions. So it's not the latest, I mean, it could be the latest technology, but it's not the most expensive or the most sophisticated. Sometimes they're very simple technology that is developed, a very simple solution developed to tackle problems in a particular environment. So the point is, again, fit for purpose. Fit for purpose means and starts with the capacity of the client. So what we do in sub-Saharan Africa, it's not giving them the same thing that we've done for 20 years, but looking for new ways, if they exist, to achieve problems in a way that is consistent and compatible with their capacity, with their ability to maintain, and with their environment. And also, innovation is not necessarily multinationals. It really depends on what you want to achieve and what market exists. Many times it's SMEs. Sometimes it's local SMEs. Sometimes it's mobilizing communities. Sometimes, it really depends. So fit for purpose is what should drive us to decide in that particular circumstance what is the best way with what it exists to achieve with value for money, which means quality, cost, and then you have to also make sure that it's implementable, right, and maintainable, right? You build something that cannot be maintained, no value for money. Don't do that. Do something perhaps with a community, if possible. So there's any different, but innovation, that's why I was saying it's part of the DNA, is thinking differently, right? It's not saying I want to get the latest, I mentioned before NASA because that's in the US, but if I have sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps it's something very, very simple that maybe I learned in another country that are doing, and like the people went to Puglia here to see how do we deal with some irrigation problems from the World Bank. And we saw there's some simple and very, very good things that perhaps we can do in other places. So that's what we do, and we think a lot about capacity. KPIs, well, first of all, you also talking broadly about M&E here, and there is, of course, many ways that the bank has to evaluate also independently the impact that we have of our projects on development. That's over time. And procurement, it's a little bit more complex because there are many, many different components of what has an impact on development. But we have an M&E system that we developed, and we're starting now with inputs because we don't have projects yet that are mature enough. But we have also indicators that we are developing to see whether procurement has been able to have some impact on elements of growth, for example, on elements of that you can link to development. For example, more dynamic local market, better prices, more bidders. So we're looking at that. But KPI, before I refer to the contract specifically, and those are linked to risks to the contract, meaning social, environmental, integrity, payment, capacity, the parties don't talk, everything that could paralyze the contract, which goes back to the discussion this morning, and that needs to be monitored very closely by the client, by the borrower, but we now monitor that directly and very closely to help them implement it.
Okay, we have time for a last question from there. No, it's not a one.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Oliviero Papa from the Italian Digital Agency. I would like to ask a question to Mr. De Laurentiis. I would like to ask you which kind of tools do you use to aggregate innovative demand in local suburbs or maybe local area instead of to mitigate risk aversion from small areas?
Sure, I understand the question. What kind of engagement? We engage significantly with... Yeah.
Because as Italian Digital Agency, we recognize that one of the main risk aversions comes from the fear of loss of money. So we realized that aggregated the demand at a local level can be a way to mitigate the risk aversion. And I would like to ask you if there are some tools that the World Bank implement in this sense.
We're talking about framework contracts here and use of e-procurement. Yes, we use that extensively. First of all, e-procurement was mentioned before. I think it's not even innovation anymore. But anyway, it's still the key tool to achieve value for money when you have more common use goods, off-the-shelf services, even some type of works now, simpler works, not very complex works. So we promote e-procurement in every country. We help with the latest technology, and we help with e-procurement reform. Framework contracts I use extensively, and we work with, again, to help them aggregate, because it starts with an analysis of the market again. What are the prices that you're paying, and who's offering, and where, and what are the opportunities to aggregate and where. So we actually use a methodology which is not in any particularly innovative, in a McKinsey type, where you really do cost analysis, right, of the, and then you aggregate, compare the demand and the offer, and sometimes you find out that they're buying all over the place as different specs and different things. So we do that analysis, and then we encourage to use framework contracts, but these are their framework contracts. We don't impose another framework. We have standard models, but it's really when they're buying like already computer and they're buying well, for example, and we have a project that finances computers, we say, okay, use your framework contract. If they're not doing well, we help them improve that.
Okay, thank you.
Comment on that. If I don't know if you are aware that Australia did a major reform on the digital ICT and the procurement of ICT, and they attributed it to the digital agency. So I encourage you to look at the report they issued last year on digital, on the procurement of digital and ICT. It's very interesting.